I watched my brother slide the revised estate documents across the mahogany conference table while my father nodded approvingly. The lakeside cabin Mom spent 20 years restoring, the property she explicitly told me would be split equally between Brian and me, was now being redistributed. My monthly share of the business profits dropping from $1,450 to a mere $435, while Brian's tripled to over $4,000. When I opened my mouth to protest, Dad cut me off with the same dismissive wave he'd perfected throughout my childhood. Brian just smiled that infuriating smile, the one that said he'd won again, and I should have seen it coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next changed everything. By the time I finished, Brian lost more than just his golden child status. He lost the business, the cabin, his marriage, and any illusion that manipulating family came without consequences. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Amanda Chen, and at 34, I'd finally achieved what I'd been working toward since graduating summa cum laude from Portland State. Senior financial consultant at Mercer & Associates, a corner office overlooking the Willamette River, and a pristine two-bedroom condo in the Pearl District that represented every sacrifice, every late night, every moment I chose career over comfort. My mother would have been proud. Would have been, because she died 2 years ago from complications of ovarian cancer, leaving behind a hole in our family that quickly revealed all the cracks her presence had been holding together. Mom was the equalizer in the Chen family. She'd immigrated from Taiwan at 19, worked 3 jobs while putting herself through community college, and eventually became a successful real estate agent specializing in commercial properties. She understood the value of hard work because she'd lived it. More importantly, she understood fairness in ways my father never quite grasped. Growing up, she made sure Brian and I both had equal opportunities, equal expectations, equal consequences. When Brian got his first car at 16, I got one too. When he received help with his college tuition, so did I. She never played favorites, never suggested that my brother's future mattered more than mine simply because he was male. My father, Howard Chen, saw things differently. He'd built Chen & Associates from a small import business into a moderately successful operation worth approximately $3 million. He employed 12 people, maintained relationships with manufacturers across Southeast Asia, and took pride in being a self-made man who'd achieved the American dream. He was also a traditional Chinese patriarch who believed sons carried the family name and daughters eventually belonged to other families. No matter how many times Mom challenged this thinking, it remained embedded in his worldview like bedrock beneath soil. Brian, 4 years my senior, had always been Dad's crown prince. Where I studied accounting and finance, building expertise in corporate tax strategy and investment analysis, Brian drifted through a business degree at a state school, barely maintaining the GPA needed to graduate. Where I worked summers at accounting firms, building my resume and professional network, Brian lifeguarded at the community pool and partied with his fraternity brothers. Yet somehow, when we both finished college, Dad offered Brian a management position at Chen & Associates while suggesting I might want to find opportunities elsewhere to broaden my experience. I found those opportunities. I worked at a mid-size firm for 5 years, earning my CPA and building a reputation for thorough analysis and creative problem-solving. I moved to Mercer & Associates, one of Portland's most respected consulting firms, and climbed from associate to senior consultant in 6 years. I purchased my condo at 32, paid off my student loans at 33, and maintained an investment portfolio that would fund a comfortable retirement. I did it all without Dad's help, without the family business safety net, without the assumption that success would be handed to me. Brian, meanwhile, floated through Chen & Associates with a vague title of sales director and an actual job description that seemed to involve golf outings with potential clients and expensive lunches that rarely converted to contracts. He married Olivia Park, a social climber from a wealthy Korean family who cared more about country club memberships than genuine connection. They had 2 children, Tyler and Chloe, who I adored despite their parents' superficiality. They lived in a sprawling house in West Lynn that Dad had helped finance, drove luxury vehicles leased through the company, and maintained a lifestyle perpetually hovering just beyond their actual income. Mom saw through all of it. She loved Brian, loved her grandchildren, but she wasn't blind to the disparity in effort versus reward. She worked until 6 months before she died, selling properties and saving every commission check. She bought a lakeside cabin in Hood River 12 years ago, a modest 2-bedroom structure on an acre of wooded property with private access to the Columbia River. She spent weekends there, gradually renovating it into something special. New dock, updated kitchen, expanded deck overlooking the water. She'd take me there, just the two of us, and we'd talk about life, about fairness, about building something that lasted. She told me explicitly, multiple times, that the cabin would be mine and Brian's equally when she passed. She had it written into her will, notarized and filed with her attorney. The business shares she'd accumulated over 30 years of marriage, the modest investment accounts she'd built, the life insurance policy, all split down the middle. Fair and equal, the way she'd always operated. The funeral was a blur of flowers and sympathetic faces. Dad seemed diminished, genuinely lost without Mom's organizational skills and emotional intelligence. Brian played the devoted son, giving a eulogy that painted him as far more attentive than he'd actually been during Mom's final months. I said nothing, too grief-stricken to perform, too aware that my relationship with Mom had been private and real rather than public and performative. The will reading happened 3 weeks later. Richard Chen, Dad's younger brother and the one family member who'd always treated me with respect, attended as a witness. Mom's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, walked us through the documents. Everything was as Mom had described. Business shares split equally, Brian receiving 22%, me receiving 22%, with Dad retaining his 56% majority. The investment accounts divided precisely down the middle. The life insurance policy split the same way. And the Hood River cabin, titled jointly to Brian Chen and Amanda Chen, to be maintained or sold with mutual agreement required for any decisions. Dad signed the documents without comment. Brian smiled and thanked Patricia for her time. I felt a small measure of peace knowing Mom's final wishes would be honored. That peace lasted approximately 4 months. The first hint of trouble came during a family dinner at Dad's Lake Oswego house. Eric, my fiancé of 6 months, accompanied me. We'd met through mutual friends, and his calm steadiness balanced my driven intensity perfectly. He worked in software development, understood long hours and professional ambition, and never once suggested my success was threatening or unnatural. He was eating dinner with my family for the 3rd time, still learning the dynamics, still trying to navigate the undercurrents he sensed but couldn't quite identify. Brian arrived late with Olivia and the kids. They'd been looking at boats, apparently, something about upgrading their current model to something more suitable for entertaining clients. Dad brightened when Brian walked in, the way he always did, his golden child bringing energy and validation simply by showing up. We ate Mom's recipes prepared by Dad's housekeeper, and the conversation stayed surface level until dessert. That's when Brian brought up the cabin. He'd been thinking, he said, about the property's potential. Hood River real estate was appreciating rapidly. The cabin, while sentimental, was underutilized. Perhaps they should consider selling, splitting the proceeds, using the capital for more productive investments. Dad nodded along, seemingly considering this reasonable financial planning. I set down my fork carefully. Mom loved that cabin. She spent years making it perfect. Selling feels wrong. Brian's expression shifted, just slightly, into something resembling patience with a slow child. Amanda, I understand you're emotional about this, but we need to think practically. The property requires maintenance, property taxes, upkeep. Neither of us uses it regularly. The smart move is to liquidate the asset. I actually use the cabin, I said quietly. Eric and I were there 2 weekends ago. We're planning to spend Thanksgiving there. I use it all the time. Brian waved this away like swatting a mosquito. A few weekends a year isn't regular use. I'm talking about maximizing return on investment. The property could sell for $600,000, maybe more. That's $300 each. You could invest that money properly instead of letting it sit there gathering moss. The conversation moved on, but something nagged at me. Brian had never cared about the cabin before. He'd visited maybe twice since Mom died, both times briefly. His sudden interest in liquidating felt calculated rather than practical. I made a mental note to review the property deed and our co-ownership agreement. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Brian. Formal, brief, and copied to Dad. He'd gotten appraisals from 3 real estate agents. The cabin was valued between $580,000 and $620,000. He proposed listing it immediately to catch the spring market. He'd already contacted a real estate attorney about the process for jointly owned properties. All very efficient, very organized, very unlike Brian, who typically avoided paperwork and planning. I called him directly. "Since when do you care about property values and market timing?" I asked, skipping pleasantries. "Since I started paying attention to our assets." His tone carried an edge I didn't recognize. "Mom left us this property as an investment, Amanda. We should treat it like one. She left it as a place that mattered to her. A place she wanted us to keep." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sentimentality doesn't pay property taxes. Look, I've done the research. The smart financial move is to sell. You're a financial consultant. You should understand this better than anyone. I understand that you've never cared about this cabin until now. What changed?" He hung up. I sat in my office overlooking the river and felt the first real stirring of concern. Brian didn't do research. He didn't get multiple appraisals. He didn't consult real estate attorneys. Someone was pushing him, advising him, orchestrating this sudden interest in Mom's property. I called Patricia Vance, Mom's estate attorney. She confirmed that the cabin was jointly owned, requiring mutual agreement for any sale. Neither Brian nor I could force liquidation without the other's consent. However, she noted, there were legal processes for resolving disputes between co-owners if one party claimed the other was being unreasonable. It was complex, expensive, and rarely ended well for anyone. The next family dinner was tense. Dad had invited us to discuss the cabin situation, as he called it. Richard also attended, which surprised me. Uncle Richard had always been the reasonable Chen, the one who'd encouraged my education, attended my college graduation, and treated my career achievements as genuine accomplishments rather than amusing hobbies before marriage. Brian arrived with documentation. Market analysis, tax implications, opportunity cost calculations. He'd clearly had help preparing this presentation, probably from Olivia's father, who was a commercial real estate developer. He laid out his argument methodically. The cabin required $12,000 annually in property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Neither of them used it enough to justify that expense. The property value was appreciating, but so was their opportunity cost. Selling now, investing the proceeds conservatively, would generate better returns than holding an underutilized asset. Dad listened attentively, nodding at key points. When Brian finished, Dad turned to me expectantly. "Amanda, what do you think?" "I think Mom wanted us to keep it. I think she spent years making it special specifically so we'd have a place that connected us to her memory. I think selling it 6 months after her death dishonors everything she put into that property." Brian sighed dramatically. "This is exactly the emotional thinking that makes poor financial decisions. Dad, you understand business. You know that sentiment can't drive strategy." I turned to my father, really looking at him. "You've been to the cabin. You saw what Mom created there. You know how much it meant to her." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "Your mother had her attachment to the property, yes. But Brian raises valid points about practical considerations. Perhaps compromise is possible. Use the property for another year, then reconsider the sale." It felt like a loss even though nothing had been decided yet. Dad was already leaning toward Brian's position, already framing my desire to keep Mom's cabin as emotional rather than reasonable. The family dynamic I'd navigated my entire life was reasserting itself. Brian's wants versus my wants, and Dad instinctively siding with his son. Uncle Richard spoke up for the first time. "Howard, may I ask a question? Brian, you mentioned neither of you uses the property regularly. But Amanda just said she's there frequently. Which is it? Brian's jaw tightened. She goes occasionally. I wouldn't call it frequent. I was there last weekend. The weekend before that. 4 times in the past month actually. I keep a calendar on the fridge tracking usage. Would you like to see it? The point remains, Brian said quickly, that maintaining property for occasional recreational use is financially inefficient. Richard leaned back, studying his nephew. When did you become so concerned with efficiency, Brian? You've worked at Chen and Associates for what, 12 years now? Your division has consistently underperformed. Your expense reports suggest you spend more on entertainment than most people earn in salary. Suddenly you're lecturing about financial efficiency? The room went silent. Dad's face reddened. Brian, that's uncalled for, Richard continued. I'm simply observing that this urgent need to liquidate your mother's property seems inconsistent with your usual approach to assets and spending. Brian stood abruptly. I don't need to justify my financial planning to you, Uncle Richard. This is between me, Amanda, and Dad. The cabin is a jointly owned asset that's not performing. That's simply fact. After everyone left, Eric and I drove back to the condo in silence. Finally, he spoke. There's something else going on here. Brian doesn't care about efficiency or returns. He needs money. I'd been thinking the same thing. His lifestyle had always exceeded his income, but Dad's financial support had covered the gaps. If something had changed, if Dad had cut back or Brian had gotten into debt, suddenly liquidating a $600,000 asset would look very appealing. The following week, I did something that felt invasive but necessary. I used my professional network to run a background check on Brian. What I found confirmed Eric's suspicion and explained everything. Brian had 3 outstanding loans totaling nearly $200,000. 2 were from private lenders with interest rates that suggested desperation. He had 4 maxed credit cards. His house, the one Dad had helped purchase, had been refinanced twice, currently carrying a mortgage of $580,000 on a property worth maybe $650,000. Brian wasn't interested in smart investing. He was drowning in trying to grab my life raft to save himself. I scheduled lunch with Uncle Richard at a quiet restaurant in Northwest Portland. Over tom yum soup and pad thai, I showed him what I'd discovered. He studied the documents carefully, his expression darkening. Your father doesn't know about this, Richard said finally. Brian's been very careful to hide his financial problems. If Howard knew, he'd bail him out immediately, but even his resources have limits. Why would Dad bail him out again? Brian's in his late 30s. He should face consequences for his choices. Richard smiled sadly. You're thinking like someone who's always been responsible, Amanda. Your father thinks like someone who's always protected his son from consequences. It's why Brian never learned to manage money properly. Every bad decision got smoothed over. So what do I do? If I refuse to sell, Brian might take legal action to force partition. If I agree to sell, I'm funding his irresponsibility and giving up something Mom specifically wanted us to keep. There's a third option. Richard pulled out his phone and sent me a contact. This is my attorney, Stephen Walsh. He specializes in business and estate law. Talk to him about options for protecting your interest in the property while potentially buying out Brian's share. I met with Stephen Walsh the next morning. His office occupied the top floor of a sleek building in downtown Portland, all glass and steel with views stretching to Mount Hood. He listened to my situation without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. You have several paths forward, but they all require you to be comfortable with conflict. Your brother is in financial distress, which makes him dangerous. Desperate people make aggressive moves. What kind of moves? He could file for partition by sale. Given that you both own equal shares and disagree on usage, a judge might order the property sold with proceeds split. It's expensive and slow, but it's an option he has. Can I prevent that? You can make it very unattractive for him to pursue. First, document your usage of the property extensively. Photos, receipts, visitor logs. Show that you're actively using it while he's not. Second, get the property appraised independently and make him an offer to buy out his half. If he refuses a fair market offer, it weakens any argument that you're being unreasonable about refusing to sell. And if he accepts my buyout offer? Then you own the cabin outright and he can't force anything. But based on what you've told me about his financial situation, he needs cash quickly. A buyout paid over time won't help him. He wants the property sold to an outside buyer so he gets a lump sum. Over the next 2 weeks, I assembled my case. I photographed every visit to the cabin, saved every receipt for maintenance and improvements, created a detailed log showing I'd spent 32 nights there in the past 6 months. I hired my own appraiser who valued the property at $595,000. I had Stephen draft a formal offer to purchase Brian's 50% share for $297,500. Financed through my investment accounts with payment in full within 60 days. I sent the offer via certified mail, copied to Dad and Uncle Richard. The offer was generous, clean, and gave Brian exactly half the appraised value with no realtor fees or closing costs to reduce his take. Brian's response came 3 days later, not through certified mail but through an unexpected phone call from Dad. His tone carried an edge I'd rarely heard directed at me. "Amanda, we need to talk about this buyout offer you sent your brother. It's a fair offer, Dad. Market value for his half of the property. He gets his equity without forcing a sale. Fair? You're trying to take advantage of your brother's situation. He needs the full value of the property, not half. The cabin should be sold to maximize what both of you receive." I sat in my office, phone pressed to my ear, watching rain streak down the windows. Dad, Brian and I each own 50%. If the cabin sells for $600,000, we each get $300 after costs. I'm offering him $297 with no selling expenses. He actually comes out ahead. You're being deliberately obtuse. Brian has expenses, obligations. He needs liquidity. You're sitting on resources, blocking him from accessing what's rightfully his portion of Mom's estate. The conversation continued in circles for 20 minutes. Dad had fully adopted Brian's position, framing my desire to keep the cabin as selfishness rather than honoring Mom's wishes. When I mentioned Brian's debt, Dad went silent for a long moment. "How do you know about that?" His voice turned cold. "I'm a financial consultant, Dad. I know how to read warning signs. Brian's lifestyle has always exceeded his income. The sudden urgency to liquidate assets isn't about smart investing. It's about covering bad decisions. What your brother does with his money is his business. What matters now is that you're preventing him from accessing his inheritance. Your mother would be disappointed in your selfishness." The words hit like a physical blow. Dad had never spoken to me that way before, never weaponized Mom's memory against me. I realized then that Brian hadn't just convinced Dad to support the sale. He'd turned Dad against me entirely. I hung up and called Stephen Walsh immediately. "We need to prepare for escalation. Dad's been completely turned. Brian's going to push for partition." Stephen's response was measured. "Then we make sure you're positioned as the reasonable party. Continue documenting everything. I'll prepare a response to any partition filing that demonstrates your good faith efforts to resolve this fairly." The next development came from an unexpected direction. Olivia called me, which had never happened in the 7 years since she'd married Brian. Her voice was strained, artificial politeness barely masking hostility. "Amanda, I think we should meet for coffee. Woman to woman, we can sort this out." We met at a Starbucks in the Pearl District, neutral territory close to my condo. Olivia arrived in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her makeup flawless despite the early morning hour. She ordered an elaborate latte and got straight to business. "Brian's under tremendous pressure right now. You're making everything harder by being stubborn about the cabin. Families help each other during difficult times. I sipped my plain coffee. Families also don't lie about financial disasters and try to force others to bail them out. Her expression hardened. You've always looked down on us. The successful career woman, too important for family obligations. Brian works hard providing for his family. He deserves support, not judgment. Brian works a cushy job at Dad's company that he'd never have gotten on merit anywhere else. I worked my way up in competitive firms where nobody cared about my last name. We're not the same. Olivia leaned forward, dropping any pretense of friendliness. Brian needs that money, Amanda. His situation is more serious than you understand. If you cared about your niece and nephew, you'd stop being selfish about a property you barely use. I use it constantly. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is Brian got himself into debt through poor choices, and now he wants me to sacrifice something Mom specifically wanted us to keep so he can dig himself out. She stood abruptly, gathering her expensive purse. You're going to regret this. Brian has options you haven't considered. Family always finds ways to take care of their own. The threat was clear even if the specifics weren't. I called Uncle Richard as soon as Olivia left. He listened to my account of the meeting and sighed heavily. Howard's been pressuring me too. Suggesting I talk sense into you. Brian's done a thorough job painting you as the villain in this situation. What exactly is Brian telling people? That you're wealthy and successful but won't help your struggling brother. That you're using Mom's memory as an excuse to be petty. That you've always been jealous of his relationship with your father. He's rewriting history to make himself the victim. The next blow came during Chen and Associates' quarterly shareholder meeting. As minority shareholders, Brian and I were entitled to attend and review company financials. I'd rarely exercised this right before, trusting Dad's management. This time, I came prepared with questions. The numbers revealed what I'd suspected. Brian's division showed consistent losses. His expense account was astronomical. His salary, nearly twice what someone with his actual productivity should earn, represented pure nepotism. More concerning, I noticed several unusual transactions. Large payments to consulting firms I didn't recognize, contracts with vendors who seemed to exist only on paper. After the formal meeting, I asked Dad about these irregularities. He deflected, claiming everything was legitimate business expenses. But his discomfort was obvious. I made copies of the financial documents and took them to Stephen Walsh. His forensic accountant spent 3 days analyzing the records. The report was damning. Brian had been siphoning money from Chen and Associates through fake consulting contracts and inflated vendor payments. Over the past 4 years, he diverted approximately $370,000 into shell companies he controlled. It wasn't technically embezzlement since Dad seemed aware and complicit, but it was certainly unethical and potentially illegal depending on how the business was structured and taxed. This changes everything, Stephen said. Your brother isn't just in debt. He's been committing fraud with your father's knowledge or at minimum his willful ignorance. If this became public, the business could face serious legal consequences. I sat in Stephen's office processing this information. My brother wasn't just irresponsible. He was criminal. My father wasn't just favoring his son. He was enabling actual fraud. Everything I believed about maintaining family relationships, about finding reasonable compromises, evaporated in the face of this deliberate betrayal. What are my options? I asked finally. Stephen pulled out a fresh legal pad. You can report this to authorities. The IRS would be very interested in these shell companies and whether proper taxes were paid. You can file a shareholder derivative lawsuit claiming Brian and Howard have harmed the company through self-dealing. You can use this as leverage to force Brian to accept your buyout offer. Or you can walk away, sell your shares, and wash your hands of the entire situation. Walking away felt like letting them win. Reporting them felt like nuclear war. Leverage seemed like the middle path, but it meant threatening my own father with legal consequences. I'd never imagined being in this position, choosing between family loyalty and basic ethics. I need time to think. Can you prepare documentation for all three options? I want to know exactly what each path looks like before deciding. Over the next week, Stephen's team assembled comprehensive files. The criminal referral package for the IRS and state authorities. The shareholder lawsuit with detailed allegations of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. The leverage proposal offering to keep everything quiet in exchange for Brian accepting my buyout and both Brian and Dad signing agreements to cease any attempts to force sale of the cabin. Eric found me sitting at our dining table at 2 a.m, documents spread across every surface. He made tea and sat beside me quietly. This is tearing you apart. I wanted to keep Mom's cabin. That's all. I just wanted to honor what she wanted. And instead I've discovered my father and brother are criminals who've been stealing from the family business for years. What would your mom want you to do? The question stopped me. Mom had always been about fairness, about integrity, about doing what was right even when it was hard. She'd built her own success honestly. She'd never tolerated shortcuts or ethical compromises. If she were here, seeing what Brian and Dad had done, what would she advise? She'd tell me to protect myself and do what's right, even if it meant burning bridges with people who'd already burned them from their side. The next morning, I called a family meeting. Dad, Brian, Uncle Richard, and myself. I chose a conference room at a hotel, neutral ground with no emotional history. Stephen Walsh attended as my legal representation, which immediately put everyone on edge. I distributed copies of the forensic accounting report. Watched Brian's face drain of color. Saw Dad's hands tremble slightly as he flipped through pages documenting years of fraud. Uncle Richard's expression shifted from confusion to fury as he absorbed what his brother and nephew had done. This is what I've discovered about Chen and Associates' financial practices over the past 4 years. Shell consulting companies, fake vendor contracts, diverted funds. $370,000 stolen from a business that employed 12 people whose jobs depend on its stability. Brian found his voice first. This is ridiculous. Those are legitimate business expenses. You're manufacturing accusations because you're angry about the cabin. I slid another document across the table. These are articles of incorporation for Cascade Consulting Solutions. Filed 3 months after Brian joined Chen and Associates. Brian is listed as the sole owner. Cascade has billed Chen and Associates over $180,000 for consulting services. But according to my investigation, Cascade has no employees, no office, no actual business operations. It exists purely to move money from the family business into Brian's personal accounts. Dad's face had gone from red to gray. Those payments were approved. Everything was documented properly. Documented, yes. But the services supposedly provided never happened. There's no work product, no deliverables, no evidence that Cascade Consulting actually consulted on anything. It's a shell company designed to extract money from Chen and Associates while avoiding proper tax treatment as salary or bonuses. Stephen Walsh spoke up, his tone professionally neutral. Mr. Chen, I've reviewed the corporate structure and tax filings for both entities. The payments to Cascade were categorized as business expenses, reducing Chen and Associates' taxable income. However, if these payments represent disguised compensation to Brian, they should have been reported differently. The IRS takes a dim view of using shell companies to avoid payroll taxes and misrepresent business expenses. Uncle Richard had been silent until now, his jaw clenched as he read through the documents. Howard, did you know about this? Did you actively help Brian set up these schemes? Dad wouldn't meet his brother's eyes. Brian needed help. The business could afford it. I don't see what the problem is. The problem is fraud. Richard's voice rose. The problem is you've been stealing from a company that supports 12 families. The problem is you've exposed Chen and Associates to massive legal liability because you couldn't tell your son no. Brian slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. Amanda's manufacturing a crisis because she won't sell the cabin. She's always resented that Dad and I are close, that I work at the family business. This is revenge dressed up as concern about bookkeeping. I remained calm, sliding yet another document across the table. This is my formal offer. Brian accepts my buyout of his cabin share at the previously offered price of $297,500. Both Brian and Dad sign agreements never to attempt forcing sale of the property or interfering with my full ownership. In exchange, I don't report the financial irregularities to authorities. The shell companies are dissolved, Brian repays what he's taken on a schedule we'll negotiate, and Chen and Associates implements proper financial controls going forward. You're blackmailing us. Brian's voice shook with rage. I'm offering you a solution to a problem you created. The alternative is I file shareholder derivative lawsuits, report the tax fraud to the IRS, and let investigators determine exactly how much you've stolen and what criminal charges are appropriate. Dad finally looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes hurt more than any of Brian's schemes. You'd destroy your own family over this? You'd send your brother to prison? I'd hold my brother accountable for years of theft. I'd protect a business Mom helped build from the people plundering it. I'd honor the basic ethical standards you apparently abandoned when it came to protecting Brian from his own failures. Uncle Richard pushed back from the table. Howard, sign the agreement. Brian, accept the buyout. You've both gotten away with behavior that should have landed you in prison years ago. Amanda's offering you mercy you don't deserve. Take it before she changes her mind. Brian looked to Dad desperately. You're not seriously considering this? She's bluffing. She won't actually report anything because it would hurt you too. I met Brian's eyes steadily. Try me. I've already prepared the criminal referral documents. They're sitting with my attorney ready to file. My shares in Chen and Associates represent maybe 8% of my total assets. I can walk away from the business entirely if necessary. Can you? The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Dad aged a decade in that conference room, the weight of his choices finally catching up. Brian's bravado crumbled as he realized his golden child status couldn't protect him from actual consequences. Stephen placed 2 copies of the agreement on the table along with pens. You have 48 hours to sign. After that, Ms. Chen proceeds with all available legal remedies without further negotiation. We left them sitting there surrounded by evidence of their fraud. In the elevator descending to the parking garage, I felt simultaneously powerful and devastated. I'd won, secured the cabin, protected myself legally. But I'd also just detonated my relationship with my father and brother. The family Mom had tried so hard to keep balanced was now irreparably fractured. Eric was waiting in the parking garage, having agreed to stay out of the meeting but be available immediately after. One look at my face and he pulled me into his arms. I stood there in the concrete dimness and let myself feel the grief I'd been suppressing for months. Not grief over losing Brian, who'd proven himself unworthy of my trust or affection. But grief over losing the father I'd wanted to have versus the father I actually had. The next 48 hours were excruciating. Stephen received angry calls from both Dad and Brian, threats to countersue, accusations of elder abuse and financial manipulation. None of it held legal weight, but it demonstrated their desperation and rage. Olivia left a voicemail calling me a vindictive witch who'd always been jealous of Brian's happiness. I deleted it without listening to the whole message. Uncle Richard called on the second evening. They're going to sign. Howard's terrified of prison at his age. Brian's terrified of losing everything. They'll sign tomorrow morning at Stephen's office. How's Dad taking it? Richard paused before answering. He's broken, Amanda. He's finally seeing what his favoritism created. What protecting Brian from every consequence cost. He's lost his wife, and now he's lost his daughter. The business he built is tainted by fraud. Brian's marriage is falling apart because Olivia's father found out about the debt and the schemes. Howard's whole world is collapsing. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy. The larger part felt only exhaustion and resolution. He made choices, Uncle Richard. For decades he made choices that valued Brian's comfort over ethics, over fairness, over me. These are just the consequences finally arriving. The signing happened at Stephen's office with minimal drama. Dad looked diminished, signing each page without comment. Brian signed with visible fury, his hands shaking as he agreed to repayment terms that would consume most of his salary for the next 5 years. The cabin became fully mine, no strings attached, no ongoing disputes. Chen and Associates would undergo an independent audit and implement controls preventing future self-dealing. As they prepared to leave, Dad finally spoke directly to me. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've done today." The words should have hurt, but I'd moved beyond that kind of pain. "Mom would be ashamed of what you enabled. Of the fraud you allowed. Of choosing Brian's lies over everyone's integrity. Don't project your guilt onto me." They left without another word. Uncle Richard stayed behind, shaking his head sadly. "Your mother was the conscience of this family. With her gone, everything she held together just fell apart. She shouldn't have had to be. Adults should have their own integrity without needing a woman to enforce it for them." Over the following weeks, the full consequences rippled outward. The independent audit of Chen and Associates discovered additional irregularities beyond what I'd found. Total diversions approached $500,000 when all the shell companies and fake vendors were traced. The auditors recommended Brian be removed from any financial oversight role. Dad, wanting to avoid criminal charges, agreed to everything. Brian's salary was cut to market rate for someone with his actual skills and productivity, roughly 60% less than he'd been receiving. Olivia filed for divorce within a month, her parents having made it clear they wouldn't support a son-in-law facing potential criminal charges and definite financial ruin. The house in West Lynn went on the market, underwater on its mortgage and likely to leave Brian with nothing after the sale. I felt no satisfaction watching my brother's life implode. Only a sad recognition that consequences had finally caught up with someone who'd spent 38 years avoiding them. Tyler and Chloe became collateral damage in a war their father had started, shuttled between parents fighting over custody while neither seemed equipped for actual parenting. The cabin became my sanctuary during this period. Eric and I spent long weekends there, repairing damage from winter storms, painting the deck, planting gardens Mom had planned but never finished. Each improvement felt like honoring her memory in ways selling could never have accomplished. We brought Uncle Richard and his wife up for a weekend. They walked the property with tears in their eyes, remembering summers when Mom was alive and the family felt whole. 6 months after the confrontation, I received an unexpected letter from Dad. Not through email or text, but actual handwritten pages on his personal stationery. He wrote about recognizing his failures, about how enabling Brian had poisoned everything, about regretting the choices that prioritized one child's immediate comfort over both children's character development. He didn't ask for forgiveness, which surprised me. He simply acknowledged the damage and expressed hope that perhaps someday I might be willing to speak with him again. I showed the letter to Eric, who read it carefully before handing it back. "What do you want to do?" "I honestly don't know. Part of me wants to believe people can change. Another part knows that decades of behavior don't shift just because consequences finally arrived. He might genuinely regret his choices, or he might just regret that his choices finally cost him something. You don't have to decide now. Or ever. You get to set the terms of your own healing." I filed the letter away without responding. Maybe in time I'd feel ready for that conversation. Maybe I wouldn't. Either way, the choice was mine, made from a position of strength rather than obligation or guilt. The business reorganization took nearly a year. Uncle Richard stepped in as interim CFO, implementing controls and rebuilding what Brian and Dad had damaged. 3 employees who'd known about the schemes were quietly let go. The company culture shifted from family indulgence to professional accountability. It was painful but necessary surgery. Brian eventually took a job at a mid-level sales position with a medical supply company. No corner office, no expense account, just straightforward commission-based work where his results determined his income. I heard through Uncle Richard that he was actually doing well, that being forced to produce real results had revealed capabilities he'd never needed to develop before. Whether that translated to genuine growth or just survival instinct, I couldn't say and didn't particularly care. Eric and I married in a small ceremony at the cabin 2 years after the confrontation. 20 guests, all people who'd earned their place in our lives through genuine connection rather than biological accident. Uncle Richard walked me down the dock where we exchanged vows with the Columbia River sparkling behind us. Mom's presence felt tangible in the space she'd created, in the choice I'd made to protect it, in the new family I was building based on respect rather than obligation. The foundation of any relationship, I said in my vows, is honoring what matters to each other. Not taking, not manipulating, not demanding sacrifice in the name of family or love or duty. Just seeing each other clearly and choosing to protect what we've each built rather than diminish it. Standing on that dock in the space my mother had lovingly restored, surrounded by people who celebrated rather than resented my success, I understood what she'd been trying to teach me all along. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about mutual respect, genuine care, and the willingness to protect each other's dignity even when it costs something. Some people never learn that lesson. Some learn it too late. I learned it just in time to save what mattered most. The cabin stands today as more than property or investment. It represents the moment I chose integrity over comfort, truth over false peace, self-respect over the hollow performance of family harmony. Brian wanted to triple his share of Mom's estate by manipulating Dad's favoritism and my supposed obligation to help family. Instead, he lost everything that wasn't nailed down by his own merit. Dad wanted to maintain his comfortable pattern of protecting his son from reality. Instead, he lost his daughter's trust and nearly destroyed his own business. I gained a beautiful property that honors my mother's memory, a marriage built on genuine partnership, and the unshakable knowledge that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. Sometimes the family you choose matters more than the family you're born into. Sometimes protecting what someone built with love means fighting the people who only understand taking. And sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property, but the example of someone who refused to let others write the ending to her story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.